The 1890s, however, witness a record number of lynchings. Most of the victims are black.
The image of lynching is frontier justice, where there's an absence of courts and there are criminals that have to be punished, and so the outraged citizenry comes together and delivers rough justice to somebody who really deserves it. But in the American South, where thousands upon thousands of victims died at the hands of lynch mobs, the purposes, the function, the way in which lynching unfolded has nothing to do with that sort of mythic image of lynching. Instead, it was a brutal form of oppression intended to silence, intimidate, and terrorize African Americans, as well as a few other groups in the South that some whites believed had to be kept in their place. So there's no way to take lynching as it unfolded in the South and gussy it up and make it into something that fits in with some sort of tradition of frontier justice. It's just raw oppression.
These instances of raw oppression do not occur as frequently in some parts of the South as in others.
Wherever there was cotton cultivation, there were tensions built into labor relations that provided those sort of flashpoints for violence between whites and blacks. In Virginia, for example, where blacks had a little bit more freedom, a little bit more economic autonomy, there are fewer of those flashpoints, so that there are still lynchings, approximately 100 in Virginia, but there aren't the 500 that there were in Mississippi.
Since lynching is an illegal activity, there are few records to show just who is involved.
However, there are a variety of ways in which we can have a pretty good idea of who participated, and it ranged with the population of the white South. There were lynchings in which most of the mob members were family members of some alleged victim of crime. There were other cases when the whole cross-cut of the community, white community, would participate. So it's not as though any one group of white Southerners participated. One way of saying it is that in any given Southern community, any white Southerner could participate in a lynching. That didn't mean they always did, but they could.
The victims of lynching are as varied as the architects of the violence.
I'll use a specific example. The lynching of an African American named Sam Hose outside of Atlanta in 1899. Sam Hose originally got involved in a dispute with his white employer, defended himself, and in the process killed his attacker, his white employer. Then he fled the scene. Within a matter of days, white newspapers in Atlanta started circulating the story that he had not only murdered his employer, but then he had raped multiple times his employer's wife beside the dead body of her husband, and had nearly dashed the brains out of her young infant child.
When Sam Hose is caught and transported back to Atlanta, the train in which he is riding passes through the town where the crime had allegedly taken place. The lynch mob is waiting.
And there were thousands upon thousands of spectators who had come from Atlanta on special trains that had been run simply to carry them to the lynching. So that was a huge ritual of extermination at which thousands of people participated. It was reported in newspapers not only all over the United States, but literally around the world. The horror of lynching wasn't just what it did to the victims of the lynch mob, but of course what it must have done to the participants and what it did to the African American community and what it did to people who read about it. Richard Wright talks about how in his youth, and I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember his exact words, in his youth, it wasn't what he experienced personally that affected him most deeply about Jim Crow and white supremacy in the South. It's what he heard about secondhand. It made his imagination churn as he would hear stories of white violence. So it had to have left for African Americans a sense that at any moment their life was vulnerable. For white Southerners, it put them in the situation of having to defend these horrible, horrible murders by mobs, and one can only imagine the sort of hypocrisy or the intellectual gymnastics they had to engage in to do that. The consequences, I think, are so deeply rooted in the way in which white and black Southerners have interacted ever since that it's just fundamental to tensions between the two races in the American South and in the United States as a whole.
In the generations to come, people in the North and the South will have very different perceptions about the successes and failures of Reconstruction.
It was a success because the nation did reunite. That is an achievement in itself, despite the difficulties at every single level, great difficulties. It was a failure for African Americans. Freedom was very, very different than they had hoped and anticipated and expected. Freedom for them was living a very poor life, still dependent on the white population. Freedom for them was going to northern states or the West and encountering vicious prejudice, the same kind of prejudice that they lived in the South, knowing that their opportunities were hampered. Suffrage for black men, which they eagerly enjoyed, ended after the Republican Party left the South. So by 1900, it was a rare event for a black man to vote. So Reconstruction has to look like the Civil War in a broader perspective.